Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Out of the Park Development's YouTube channel. My name is Alex Murray, also known as AZ Axel, and today we are doing a tutorial video about team and player strategies. We will cover what each of those are and how to best utilize them to get the best results and control of your team in simmed games. So if you've got your OOTP game open, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, we'll begin this tutorial. It's going to be a bit of a long tutorial, unfortunately, so hang in there with me, guys. We'll get through all of this. But strategies is something you can access in the game, and you'll find that underneath of your team's homepage, and then the strategy tab, as you can see right up here on the top of the screen. And then overall strategy is the one that we'll start with. I'm going to make one small little tweak here so that way we can have an example of something here in a second. So let's first of all talk about strategy and what that means in OOTP. Strategies, whether they are team strategies or player strategies, are ways in which you, as the player, or the bench coach or manager of your team, can have direct input on how the team will play game in and game out. This is vitally important if you are not expecting to be controlling every single game, every single at-bat, every single pitch, etc. So if you want to be able to simulate chunks of games and you don't want to have to play every single game out, you may need to look at your strategies, because otherwise you can get the best players in the world, but if your strategies are not set up to bring out the best in those players and they aren't set up with player strategies to be the best that they can, you're only hurting yourself in how your team will perform year in and year out. All right? So understanding your team, your weaknesses, your strengths, and how your strategy settings can work to better all of that is going to be important. All right? So let's start here on the overall strategy page. As you can see, we have, in this example, we have our personnel on the left side. This will be a bench coach if you are the manager and GM. This will be a manager, and I believe also potentially a bench coach if you are just the GM. All right, so this isn't going to be much of important information in regard to the personnel side, but the global strategy settings, the second column, is going to have some very important information, and there's actually something new with our most recent version of the game on this page as well. So let's just start right up at the top. Starting pitchers, max pitch count, and relief pitchers, max pitch count. Very easy to understand. If they're set at 0, there's no pitch count. This is a global pitch count, by the way. So this will be applied to all of your starting pitchers and all of your relief pitchers, all right? If you want to put down a rule that nobody goes beyond 110 pitches for a starting pitcher, you can put that in there, and boom. Everybody will have a 110 pitch count limit for starters. You can do the same thing for relievers. If you want to do like 30, that's pretty much about an inning's worth. Now, the problem is if you have long relievers or stoppers who are supposed to go 2 innings, potentially, you may want to make some player strategies that override this. Otherwise, they will be held to the same limitations that, per se, your middle relievers, your setups, and your closers will be held to. So you may want to look into that personally, all right? So make sure that when you make global strategy setups, that if you have a player that goes against that strategy setup, that you do have a player strategy setup that will override it. And we'll talk about overriding and adjusting later. That's the 2 different modes that you can have for players. We'll talk about that in a second here. So down below that we have our use of openers. If you want your manager or bench coach to use openers during simulations as you go through the season and you're just simulating games, you can say frequently or never. You do need to have openers and followers set up in your pitching tab to be able to make that happen. So just a word of warning, you do need to have those set up. Otherwise, it may never ever use it, even if you have it set to frequently. Opener lineups, if you wanted to use opener lineups in case you ever run into somebody who has an opener and they throw an opener against you, you can make sure that the AI knows to use whatever opener lineup you have set up in your lineups tab, and that's something that you can set up as well. If you're facing an opener, you can also choose whether or not you'd like to have them base the lineup on the opener that starts the game or the follower that is expected to follow most likely behind the opener. There may be multiple followers, so the most likely follower will be picked by the AI. So if there's a left-handed opener but a right-handed follower, your AI won't base your lineup off of the left-handed opener if you want to. It'll base it off of the right-handed follower. Understandably, that's a good thing to have. Defensive substitutions, you can do global setups here if you want to have those defensive subs in your lineup's depth chart section. If you want them coming in a very early inning, like the 7th or 8th, you can do that. Otherwise, you can always just leave it at the 9th inning. You can also specify what kind of a lead you want in case you want to have them come in early or later. And I believe, yeah, you can do it either based on how many runs you have or less, or how many runs or more. So if you wanted to say, look, defensive subs, they're weaker hitters. They're just to make sure the game doesn't get out of hand. So maybe 3 runs or more. And we do defensive subs by the 7th inning. So that way we hold a ball game in check. So that way, if we have a better catcher, he comes in the 7th inning if we're leading. If we're not, we need more offense. Therefore, keep the offensive catcher in. Same thing for shortstops, center fielders, the people who are most important for your defense. Third basemen could also be on that list. That's a good way to be able to get people into the game to hold a lead, much like you would have setups and stopper relief pitchers. They'd be able to hold the lead to your closer. Positional player pinch hit starting in a default inning is basically going to be, I think that's either the 6th or the 7th, but you can specify when you would like to have positional player pinch hit starting in. This is mostly going to be, I believe, for the event that you need somebody who is taken out of the ball game because they are just such a bad hitter. So actually, a perfect example would literally be Austin Hedges. MLB catcher who has very, very good fielding, but very, very poor hitting ability. If you wanted to, say, have a person pinch hit for him in the 7th inning, you could specify the 7th inning as a potential time to start using positional player pinch hit starting. And that would allow you to be able to have someone new come in and be able to be pinch hit for. The fatigue numbers down below are some of the new things we've added for this version of OOTP. These are going to be the batting benched when fatigued, starting pitcher benching when fatigued, and a relief pitcher bench when fatigued option. And these are global settings you can apply, so that way whenever a batting person on your starting lineup goes beneath a certain fatigue level, whether that's 70%, 60%, if 50%, I definitely highly recommend, especially for batters. You really want to keep your batters over 70% from their fatigue. You don't want them going below that. Otherwise, they can run into some very, very bad performances on the field. They can still perform well, but it's less likely they will perform well if that happens. Also, the starting pitching bench, that really is going to be important. Now, you could be okay with a starting pitcher coming in around maybe like 90 plus fatigue, and that might be doable. They'd still be able to perform quite adequately, but once they get down around like 70%, they really need a day more of rest to get back to their full potential. Again, you can always throw somebody early or throw somebody before they are fully rested, but it will impact their performance for that day. And the last thing you want to do is put somebody out there who is performing, a third of their ability, or 2/3 of their ability technically. They'd be just, limited by a little bit of their own fatigue. And it just means that if the other team throws their best lineup, they're more likely to have a better favored day. So putting out your best is going to be always the best thing you can do. Putting up a starting pitching bench fatigue and a relief pitching bench when fatigue option would be very, very good if you want to have control over when the AI doesn't bring somebody in because they are fatigued. This is mostly something that we use for PT players, but it does work also here in the base game, in the standard game, because it's going to be important, especially for relievers, that you don't bring in somebody who's pitched the last 2 days and is now at 50% fatigue. And even if it's your best relief pitcher, you really don't want to bring somebody in and make them go down below 50% because they can actually injure themselves if they get too fatigued. That is actually one of the reasons why injuries happen, is because the players are used too much and their fatigue levels go too low too often. So even beyond trainers, and we'll talk about injuries later, I'm sorry to go on this tangent, but basically this is the reason why you would set up these fatigue numbers for benching, is that you don't want your players to get too fatigued too often, otherwise they run a higher risk of getting injured. And the last thing you want to do is lose one of your best relievers because they threw 4 straight days and went down to 0% restedness, they were fully fatigued, and they pull something, or they really hurt their elbow, and suddenly they're out the entire season. Not that that happened in our Desert Dreaming franchise. No, of course not. Now, when we talk about the timing and scorings column over here on the right side of all of these sliders, there are a couple things you can do. We have strategy presets that you are allowed to utilize to your own benefit, all right? So if you don't want to go through all of these and set up your own stuff, you can just select one of the ones we have listed and boom, it'll apply all of those tactics. Now, you can then go in and adjust these if you'd like to. So if you don't want to do a whole bunch of the red versions of the sliders, if you want to pull back on some of the more egregious or aggressive ones, you can do that. You can also then export whatever strategies you do. So if you have a strategy that you almost always use with your team and you're always building a team the exact same way, you can export strategies and then import them to new saves as you move forward with new games, all right? And that's one of the best ways to be able to do this, so that way you always know exactly what you're bringing into your team. But we'll talk about each of these sliders in a second here, and we'll be able to work through all of that. You can also ask your manager or bench coach for what they believe would be the appropriate strategies for this entire page, and you can see it change some of our other stuff over here as well. So, let's talk about timing and score. Timing is when you would like the strategies down below to affect your games, all right? If you want it happening early in the game, first inning through the 6th, the late period, which is the 7th or 8th, or the last inning, which is the 9th and beyond, you can do that. So if you want to be more aggressive on the base paths in the early part of the game, and then very, very conservative on the base paths in like the 9th inning or the 7th and 8th, you can come in and change just for that time of the game. On top of that, you can also change what the reaction of strategies would be depending upon the score. So you can get very minute. If you're saying, all right, we're going to run, early in the game when we are down, and then we're not going to run when we have a large lead. You could come in and say, all right, no more running when we're in a large lead early on, but when we're on a large trail, we're very aggressive. You can come in and make individual settings, and then those will be applicable only to those situations, all right? So you can get very detailed on where you want these being applied to, and I'll let you guys decide where you want stuff applied to and what that looks like. But that's just information about what timing and score is going to do, all right? And as we mentioned, stealing bases, this slider is going to be all about how often or frequently your players are going to attempt to steal. Now, this is something that you might want to also have player strategies about, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes here as well. But this is for your overall team sliders. This is for everybody. This will apply to everybody. If you want to have everybody being aggressive, you can have them all be aggressive. If you want them all to be very passive and conservative, you can have them being basically on the never slider. Space running is going to be trying to make singles into doubles, doubles into triples, and tagging up on pop flies. This is going to be something that you can either be conservative about and not try to make any aggressive base running decisions, or you can say, be aggressive, go for it. Try to turn singles into doubles and doubles into triples. Again, another slider that might be better for your player strategy page, but we'll talk about that in a couple minutes as well. Use hit and run, sack bunt, squeeze bunt plays, and bunt for hits are all of the different options that you have in game to select. These are all basically different types of approaches to an at-bat. Whether or not you want to have the hit and run be something that your team uses in game often or not, you can move this slider left or right. Same thing for sacrifice bunting and squeeze bunting. Now, for bunting, in terms of like squeeze bunting, bunting for a hit, and sacrifice bunting, I would highly recommend that you make sure your team is good at bunting before you start making these decisions, because if your team is bad at bunting, this is going to hurt your team. So again, knowing your team's strengths and weaknesses is going to be important. For something like the hit and run, you need to make sure that your team can actually steal and your team can put the ball in play. Otherwise, a hit and run is a strike them out, throw them out. Not good. You don't want to be doing stuff like that. Pitching and defensive strategies. Pitching around is going to be how often you want your pitchers to use the pitch around strategy in game and be able to not just immediately just throw strikes or attempt to throw strikes down the middle of the plate, or pitching to contact is what basically the option would be alternatively. Pitching around is going to be trying to make batters swing at pitches that are pitchers' pitches, ones that are harder to hit, ones that are not good pitches to be swinging at. The problem is that if you don't have good control pitchers, pitching around means lots of balls and lots of walks. So be careful with how you put this pitch around slider. It could become a very bad thing for your team if you don't have the right quality players to be able to utilize that. Intentional walk is just in situations in which an intentional walk would be optional. Runner on second base, runner on second and third, a really big power hitter's up to bat. Do you want the AI to even think about doing intentional walking? Is that something you'd prefer? Or is that something you'd like to never have happen? That's what the slider right here is all for. Hold runners is going to be all about how often you'd like to be able to hold the runner. Now, that means that your pitcher is going to be paying a little more attention to that, and the first baseman is going to be holding the runner on by being close to the bag, which opens up the right side gap between first and second baseman, all right? So there's going to be some strategy about how you play your fielders, and if you want to hold the runners versus no, we're just going to try to get the ground ball out. So a good example of this would be with 2 men down an inning. You've got a speedy runner at first base. Do you care if the speedy runner steals second, or would you rather try to get the ground ball out at first base, second base, on the infield, because you're worried more about the batter? Basically, this slider is, do you worry more about the runners or the batter at bat? Play infield in, play corners in, guard lines. The infield outfield shifts and the outfield depth are all, again, just defensive alignment decisions. These are all things you can choose the AI to either rarely use or never use or frequently use, all right? So if you want to see people playing the corners in on your games or guarding the lines, using the infield outfield shifts and using the outfield depth options, then put them all the way over to the frequently section. If you don't want to see a whole bunch of that being done, and you'd rather play the defense exactly where they're positioned at all times, because, you know, if you do a shift and it really doesn't work very well, or if you do stuff like the corners in and you see a lot of doubles and triples down the line because you're playing the corners in, maybe you pull that slider back and you do less of that. This can be dependent upon the fielding quality of your infielders and outfielders. If you've got bad infielders or outfielders, you may want to be more conservative about how you do shifts and, you know, guarding lines, playing the corners in, etc. All right? Substitution strategies. This is how quickly you want the AI to be doing substitutions. Hooking starting pitchers, hooking relievers, favoring or not favoring lefty-righty pitching matchups and lefty-righty batting matchups. Now, let's talk a little bit about those matchups, because the hooking is pretty easy to understand. How fast do you want the AI to pull a pitcher who's struggling or getting fatigued? I would say faster is better than slower, but only for pitchers that have lower stamina. If you've got a lot of high stamina relief pitchers and starting pitchers, you might be able to be slower on your hook strategy, because they actually are not going to fatigue as quickly, and they'll last longer and they'll perform longer in a ball game. Now, for matchups, this is going to be all about, for pitching matchups, this is having left-handed pitchers on left-handed batters and right-handed batters with right-handed pitchers, making sure that your matchups are in your favor as the defense. So if you have a good lefty slugger that you're facing off against, maybe you bring in your lefty relief pitcher for that batter to make sure they don't go yard on you and suddenly you're down in a ball game that otherwise could be a win. For batting matchups, that's keeping your batting matchups lefty-righty. So if you have a pitcher who's left-handed, maybe the AI does substitutions with right-handed batters, because that's going to be a better splits factor for that matchup, and it gives you as the offense a better advantage. Pinch hitting for pitchers is going to be how often you want to have a pinch hit for pitchers. With the standard MLB, with the DH implied for both leagues, that's pretty much negligible, because nobody has pitchers actually batting anymore in the current season that we're in right now. Pinch hitting for position players, again, that will go in with your positional player pinch hit starting in slider, which is the one in that second column. This will be able to allow you to kind of tell the AI, hey, I want to see more pinch hitting from my positional players, or no, I don't want to see any at all. If you have very good depth in your team, and there's a lot of players who are just as good as the starter on your team, you may want to have more positional player pinch hitting, because that will give you a lot more time to keep fatigue down on your starting players, and your backups are not that far of a distance away from your starters, so it won't be a massive loss to your team to have a pinch hit come in. This can also be a really good way in which you actually make sure your matchups, the lefty-righty matchups for your offense, are in your favor as well. Use pinch runners is going to be basically just as it explains. It's how often you'd like the AI to be able to bring in a pinch runner for somebody who is slow. Now, we do have, I believe, player strategies for how often or when in a ball game you'd like someone to be brought in as a pinch runner. So there are more player strategies that will go in with that option here from the global team sliders or overall strategies page, all right? But if you want to see more pinch runners or way less, if you've got a lot of good speedsters on your team and no really good pinch runner on your organization, you may want to see more towards the never side of that item. Now, again, this is for different timings and scores, so at the bottom of this page, we have a copy, paste, and reset button. If you want to copy and paste what you've just done to multiple different timings and scores, you can do that so you don't have to keep doing this over and over for every single different timing and every single different score situation, all right? So you can do all this work, copy and paste it across all the different timings and scores you want, and then export it using our strategy presets button up here. You can export it and then save all your work. So that way, if you feel like you've been having issues where the AI is changing stuff, or you've maybe accidentally hit the ask, bench coach or manager for strategies, you can very quickly get all that work back. All right. Let's quickly go through player strategies. I'm sorry for how long this video is, but there's so much to talk about, and I know that our in-game tutorial doesn't go as in-depth about this, and I want to give you guys examples of where stuff works. So, let's start with pitchers. When you have pitching strategies, here's how it's going to work. There's some offensive strategy settings for pitchers that we can quickly run over. That's going to be stealing bases, base running, hit and running, sacrifice bunting, bunting for hit. The only ones that matter for pitchers before the DH became both leagues would have been really the sacrifice bunting. And that would have been normally set to frequently. You would have normally had pitchers sack bunting a lot. Now, pitchers don't really hit, so these offensive strategies don't really matter as much, all right? All right, so that is basically the only offensive stuff you're going to care about. So the roster strategy settings are going to be a little bit more about benching. And the bench player for X days is basically a way for you to say that a player is not going to play for this amount of days. So if you have a person who's having a nagging, minimal day-to-day injury, and it's 5 days, you may come into the settings, the strategy settings page and say, hey, bench the player for 5 days. I don't want to see them on the field. You can do that. So if you've got somebody who's got a nagging injury, this is a great way to ensure that they don't get worse, because you can come into this page, put them on the bench for a certain amount of days. It includes the current day, which you're still simulating. And, if someone's got 5 days of a hamstring pull left, just put them on the bench for 5 days. Don't put them on the IL, just put them on the bench for 5 days. Just make the AI not play them. The AI will use somebody else, and once those 5 days are done, they'll come back and they'll play again. Easy peasy. Benching player if a day-to-day injury. You can also do this. This is another way to be able to do that if you want to see them play never during a day-to-day injury. You can just alternatively just set it up so that way they always are benched if the severity is minimal, moderate, substantial, or never. Or you can let the manager decide as well. So the bench X amount of days is for you to override the AI. That's just for you to come in and say, no, he's being benched for this amount of days. You can also do that for people who are cold. If they have had really bad performances, that might be able to break them out of their cold streak and maybe get them reset. That's not a bad idea either for benching player for X amount of days. Below that, we have the use as a two-way player option. This is basically the people like Shohei Ohtani and Brendan McKay, who are in MLB right now, who are both pitchers and hitters. You can allow the AI to use the player as both a hitter and a pitcher. They'll show up on the lineups and pitching tabs this way. So if you've got a person who both hits and pitches well, you'll want to make sure that their use as a two-way player is checked on. And you can see we get lots more options when we set that up. Let me take that off for right now. Now, skip DH when pitching. This is basically the new Shohei Ohtani rule. This allows you to skip the DH when this individual is pitching. So, for example, we'll use Shohei Ohtani. When Ohtani is pitching, they want him to also be the DH, which means they basically don't want to qualify him as a starting pitcher in the lineup. They want to qualify him as both a starting pitcher and a DH. So what you can do is during the game, excuse me, you can have the player be, you can skip the DH when pitching. So that way when the pitcher is pulled out of the ball game, he remains in the game as the DH. All right? And last but not least, we have the lock to team and lock strategy settings that allows us to be able to basically make sure that the player is set up with the team they're at. It locks the strategy settings for this player, I believe. Yes. And it also locks them to the team. So it'll actually disable AI promotion demotion of the player, all right? Usually this was just simply a lock to team, locked or disable AI promotion demotions checkbox. We added the lock strategy settings so that way when you do move the player, if they are moved or control settings for the human manager are changed, it will disable the AI control over those settings if the player is moved or the human manager are changed. So that way the player will remain with the settings they had. All right, so now that we talked a little bit about the offensive strategy for pitchers, and we talked about all this stuff in there here in the middle, let's go ahead and reference the last column on the right side before we get on to hitters. Now, the first thing I need to talk about is this mode, because as you can see, all the sliders look very similar to the ones we had on the overall or team strategies page, and that is the truth. That is true. We have a lot of stuff that's similar, but the abilities of the player strategies page is to make individual changes that can either be adjusting to the team strategy settings or overriding the team strategy settings. And allow me to explain what each of these does. The override team strategy setting discards all of the overall strategies or team strategy settings. So everything we worked on in that first page gets discarded. All of these sliders trump or override all of those sliders, all right? Adjust to team strategy settings means it will merge with your team strategy or overall strategy page sliders, all right? So, for example, for starting pitchers, if we want to have a quick hook in our team strategies page, we may say, all right, this person in particular has a higher stamina. Our example player has high stamina, which means we would prefer to see him be slower on the hook. Now, what that means is that if our team strategy is a -3 or 3 notches to the left, these are all 5-notch increments. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you can see. So the way that I view it is it's -5 to 0 to +5, all right? If we adjust to the team strategy settings, that means that if we put our team strategy settings at -2, and we put our player strategies for this example starting pitcher at +5, that means it takes the -2 and applies it to the +5, and we get a +3, which means it will actually be more like this, even though we set up the player strategies to be slow. So in that situation, you may want to override versus adjust to the team strategy settings, all right? But the team strategy settings are really good if you want all of your players being aggressive, if you want all of your players having quick hooks, just so that way you don't have to do a whole bunch of individual player strategies, all right? That's the general consensus, is that you're going to have some stuff that is global across your entire team, and then you're going to have some player strategies that are individualized just to one player. And you can either adjust or override. Now, you cannot go beyond or below the +5 or -5 respectively, all right? You can't do a -5 team strategy hook for starter and then do -5 on top of that with your player strategies and get -10. That will only result in a -5, and it will limit itself at the cap at a -5 or a +5, all right? So, for example, if you've got a speed demon and you have your team at +5 on stealing bases, you can't get a +10 stealing bases by having a player strategy that goes 5 more into stealing bases, and we'll talk about that in a second too. So, again, it has caps at -5 +5. It will adjust or add, basically, the player strategies to the overall team strategies to come up with a new strategy slider setting, all right? And again, All of these sliders here on this page are the same ones that we talked about in the team strategy settings. It's just allowing you to be able to make individual changes for this one person that you're utilizing, so that way they can have a customized player strategy if they contradict or are the one exception to your global team strategies. All right? Optionally, on top of that, if you want to have a pitcher be given an even more aggressive hook ability, you can put on this one little checkbox. If they're getting tired and you know that when this pitcher individually gets tired, they start to suffer more than other pitchers do in your organization, you can have a more aggressive tiredness hook that allows your AI to know, okay, just an alert, when this person starts to tire, hook them faster than normal, all right? Again, you can also do pitch counts and batters faced limits. I know we talked a little bit about, I believe, pitch counts back on the overall strategies page, but you can set up individual pitching limits if you want to. Right now they're set to no limit as 0. So in addition to pitch counts, you can also do batters faced. So if you want to see a pitcher only face at maximum as a starter, say 18 batters, 2 times through the order. That's it. That's all you want them to ever face. You can put down batters faced 18. And it'll only have the pitcher face 18 batters, and then the AI will pull them. Or it will try to, at least. This is a way for you to tell the AI when you would like to see them get pulled. I don't know if it's exactly at 18. If it's like, there's 2 outs in the inning, maybe they'll do 19 just to get them through the inning. The AI, though, does take this into effect when it comes to how often and how long to have a pitcher go for. All right? Optionally, you can also do forced roles for pitchers. We'll talk about this for batters as well. You can force a pitcher to be a starter, reliever, closer if they are, being, put into a position by the AI that you do not appreciate or do not agree with, especially if you're not in control of your pitching rotation, pitching bullpen. You can actually come into the player strategies and override a manager's or bench coach's decision if you do not have direct control over your pitching and even lineups as well, all right? So if you've got somebody who is being put into the rotation and you got them to be a relief pitcher only, they only have 2 pitches, but they're very high stamina, you may want to come in and say, no, make them a reliever, force them to be a reliever, and put the force role on them. Again, we also have the starting pitching bench when fatigue and relief pitching bench when fatigue. Much like the first page we talked about, this is a way for you to set an individual fatigue level for this player. So if you've got a fragile player who you don't ever want to see getting fatigue beyond, a certain level, you may want to have much more of a higher fatigue or bench when fatigue number in these 2 spots for their player strategies page, all right? Especially if somebody is wrecked or fragile. You don't want to push them too hard. And again, we'll talk about that with injuries down the road as well. Optionally, you can also set them up as openers and followers. This is the page you'll want to be able to do that in. This is for pitchers. You'll be able to set them up as openers and followers, and your AI will then utilize that information to set up your team. All right, let's lastly talk about batters. Batters have some of the same options. As you can see, I've already made some changes on the screen for this guy right here. This is how you'll be able to do, again, the adjust to or override your team strategy settings to be able to make sure that this player gets their own specified or individualized player strategy. Now, in addition to all of the usual ones, stealing bases, base running, hit and run, sacrifice bunt, bunt for hit, which again, all of these bunting ones, you got to make sure they bunt well, otherwise it's a useless skill and you're going to make them out. On top of that, we have depth chart settings. This is a way for you to be able to force start a player at a position, much like we did the force roll for pitchers. This is the one for batters. You can force them to be a starter at a certain position, whether that is catcher, infield, outfield, or DH. Now, in addition to that, we have the ability to force them into a lineup spot or bench them versus lefties or righties. So if you want to say a platoon is going to happen at first base because you've got a left-handed and a right-handed batting first baseman, for lefties, you would sit or bench a left-handed first baseman, left-handed batting first baseman, and then for the versus right-handed pitchers, you could force them into the lineup at a certain place in the lineup. If you know that this is your slugger, you'd put him at the cleanup spot, fourth. But then you could optionally still keep them benched, third or fourth, whatever you want to do. So you can bench them versus one-sidedness of a pitcher and then have them in the lineup versus another. And this is a great way to be able to do platoons easily without having to have the AI have a bunch of depth chart settings, which you can still optionally do that as well. You can always still go into your lineups versus right-handed pitchers versus left-handed pitchers and set them up to be different and use platoons that way. But if the AI is not doing that and you don't have control over your lineups, this is how you can set that up if you don't have control. All right? Again, also, we have a bench when fatigue level as well, so you can set that up to be as much as you'd like it to be, and then be able to tell them to, when a person is benched beyond a certain amount, they automatically get benched because their fatigue is too much. You can have a checkbox to say that if they are tired and they have been benched, they could be available as a defensive substitution. So that would mean that they don't get as much fatigue in a ball game because they don't come in as a starter. They come in later as a defensive substitution. This would be very good if you have a center fielder or a shortstop who is tired, but you have a close game and you'd like to still see them come in and play as a defensive substitution. All right? That's a good setting to be able to have for there. Minimum innings to remove for defensive sub and to insert as defensive sub is basically allowing you to tell the game when you'd like to see this happen. If you want to see them remove for defensive subs, you can set up an inning that they will be able to be set up inside of to be able to start looking to remove that player at a certain point in the game. And then optionally, you can also have a minimum inning to insert as a defensive sub. So if you've got a defensive substituting catcher that you want to bring later in a ball game, you can make this setting be something like the 6th or the 7th and be able to make sure that they come in, or at least generally will come in as a defensive substitution starting at that inning. All right? And again, that's going to run in line with your defensive substitution team strategies that we set up earlier, or we talked about earlier, how we can tell the game in what situation we want to have defensive substitutions coming into the ball game. So it isn't going to happen automatically in every single game, even if you're losing by like 7 runs, but it'll happen whenever your setup matches what your requirements are for defensive substitutions. All right? Lastly, because the roster strategies is the exact same thing, benching player for X amount of days, use it 2 ways, skip DH when pitching. Those are all the same things that happen for the pitchers. So lastly, pinch hit settings. You can have checkboxes for different individual situations. You can tell the AI to never lift the player for a pinch hitter. If this is your best hitter on your team, you can set it up so that way we never lift the player for a pinch hitter ever, because they are the best hitter on the team. You can also say save for high leverage PH or pinch hitting chances. Now, this is really good for your pinch hitters list. And we talked about that a little bit, I believe, in our last video about lineups and how the pinch hitters list goes 1, 2, 3, 4. What you can do is you can have individual players saved for high leverage pinch hitting situations versus non-high leverage. It doesn't matter if you bring a pinch hitter in the 7th inning with nobody on, but if in the 9th inning you have a pinch hitting situation and you would have preferred to have used that batter, then, because you have bases loaded and you're down by 2, you can tell the AI to save individual pinch hitters for more higher leverage situations so you don't waste them in non-high leverage situations. Optionally, if the player is tired or having a day-to-day injury, you can also tell the AI that they're available as a pinch hitter instead of getting them a full day off. This is really good if you're giving your best hitter the day off, but, in the situation that you do need a pinch hitter in a high leverage situation, they would be optionally available, and that's very good to have. You can also have a setting here for minimum inning to remove for a pinch hitter. So if you want to be able to say, hey, this is a good defensive catcher, but by the 7th inning, I want them pinch hit for by a good, so that way a better hitting catcher, comes in, because defense probably won't matter as much 7th, 8th, or 9th inning. And it could be also the other way. Maybe you want it to be more of a center fielder who's a defensive center fielder. Now, a lot of people will prefer to have better defenders late in the ball game, but if you're losing late in a ball game, you may prefer to have a better hitter for the last couple of at-bats. So you can also set it up here to be able to remove them for a pinch hitter if you don't want to see them playing past a certain point of time. This would also be a great way to keep somebody from becoming too fatigued if they play every single ball game and you know they're going to get fatigued and there's little bench or backup players in your organization to replace them, you may want to see about having them removed often for a pinch hitter to keep them more fresh. Lastly, there are a couple of sliders for pinch hitting for the player. You can tell the AI how often you'd like to see them be pinch hit for. If you don't want to see them get pinch hit for very often, you can just put it down to rarely. So you could do something where you mix it up. You say, okay, I want him to be able to be pinch hit for starting from the 7th inning on. So that way he's not getting pinch hit for earlier than the 7th. But then I want to see him rarely get pinch hit for. So, if this is your best hitter, you can set it up for that. Or you could just even say never lift for a pinch hitter, and then it never will. But if it's somebody that you know that you're going to need to give some time off to, and you want to say occasionally, go ahead and pinch hit for him. You could do something like this, where it'll then go ahead and say, all right, 7th inning, maybe we look at doing a pinch hit for this player if the optimization is correct and it's a good timing for that. Pitch hitting platoon usage. You can also be able to set this up as well if you want the slider to be able to work with how often your pinch hitting platoon is used. And I believe that is either for the favoriteness of lefties or righties, or if you have, again, platoons in a situation, you could swap them out for the other person in the platoon. If you have 2 first basemen or 2 very good third basemen or a couple outfielders that want to get playing time, you can set that up to be used as well. And that covers all of the team and player strategies in OOTP. I do hope that you found this video helpful and that you're able to get started with OOTP more smoothly because of it. We will continue to upload more tutorial videos just like this one and other videos down the road, so please do subscribe to this channel. And I will see you all in the next one.